The night was unusually quiet in the small town of Riverbrook. Officer Patel had been patrolling the streets for nearly 10 hours, and her shift was finally winding down. The digital clock on her patrol car's dashboard blinked 11:42 p.m., and she was already dreaming about the warm cup of tea waiting for her at home. But just as she turned onto Maple Street, her radio crackled to life. Unit 247, please respond to a welfare check at Pine Grove Apartments, Building C. Multiple reports of strange noises from Unit 4B. Tenant hasn't been seen in several days. Officer Patel sat up straighter, her tiredness instantly forgotten. There was something about late-night welfare checks that always made her heart beat a little faster. In her 15 years on the force, she'd learned that these calls could be anything from a forgotten radio to, well, situations she didn't want to think about. Copy that, dispatch. En route to Pine Grove, she responded, flipping on her turn signal to head toward the apartment complex. As she drove, dispatch filled her in on more details. The tenant was Mrs. Rose Wilson, a 78-year-old widow who'd lived in the building for over 2 decades. Neighbors reported hearing scratching sounds and what they described as crying or whimpering, but no one had seen Mrs. Wilson since her usual Sunday morning walk in the garden nearly a week ago. The Pine Grove Apartments came into view. 3 weathered brick buildings that had seen better days, but were still home to many of the town's elderly residents. Officer Patel had been here before, usually for minor complaints about noise or to help residents who had locked themselves out. But tonight felt different. She pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the beam of her headlights sweeping across faded parking space lines and scattered autumn leaves. Officer Lee, her backup, arrived just moments later in another patrol car. They'd worked together long enough that they barely needed words to communicate. A simple nod, and they both headed toward Building C. The security lighting in the stairwell flickered uncertainly as they climbed to the 4th floor. Their footsteps echoed in the concrete stairwell, accompanied by the soft jingling of equipment on their utility belts. Both officers had their flashlights out, more from habit than necessity. As they reached the 4th floor landing, Officer Patel held up her hand. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to her partner. In the relative quiet of the hallway, they could make out a distinct sound coming from somewhere ahead, a rhythmic scratching, followed by what definitely sounded like a cry. They moved down the hallway, past 4A with its cheerful welcome mat, and stopped in front of 4B. The sounds were clearer now, and Officer Patel felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She'd learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, they were telling her something wasn't right. She knocked firmly on the door. "Mrs. Wilson, this is the police. We're here to check on you." The scratching sound paused briefly, then resumed with even more intensity. Another whimper followed, this one sounding almost desperate. Officer Lee tried calling Mrs. Wilson's phone, but they could hear it ringing inside the apartment with no answer. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing: they needed to get inside. The apartment manager was already on his way with a key, but each minute felt like an hour. Officer Patel pressed her ear to the door, trying to make sense of the sounds. There was something about them that seemed almost deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get their attention. Finally, they heard hurried footsteps coming up the stairs. The building manager, Mr. Singh, appeared, slightly out of breath and clutching a ring of keys. "Sorry for the delay, officers," he panted, quickly finding the right key. "Mrs. Wilson is such a good tenant. Never any trouble. I hope she's okay." As Mr. Singh inserted the key into the lock, Officer Patel positioned herself in front of the door, while Officer Lee stood ready with his flashlight. The lock clicked, and the door slowly swung open into darkness. The scratching sound suddenly stopped. "Mrs. Wilson." Officer Patel called out again, her voice steady despite her growing concern. They stepped into the apartment, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The living room was immaculate, everything in its place, no signs of struggle or disturbance. A half-drunk cup of tea sat on the coffee table, a thin film of mold floating on its surface. Next to it lay an open book, face down, as if its reader had just stepped away for a moment. But it was the scratching sound that drew their attention. It had started again, more urgent now, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. And with it came that crying sound, clearer now that they were inside, and somehow more heartbreaking. Officer Patel gestured to her partner, and they moved carefully through the apartment, checking each room methodically. The kitchen was empty, though a calendar on the wall showed several missed appointments marked in neat handwriting. The guest bathroom was undisturbed. As they approached the master bedroom, the sounds grew louder. Officer Patel's hand rested on her holster, not out of fear, but from years of training. She reached for the bedroom door handle, her heart pounding in her ears. Whatever was on the other side of that door, she knew this welfare check was about to become anything but routine. Officer Patel took a deep breath and turned the handle of the bedroom door. The hinges creaked softly as the door swung open, and both officers' flashlight beams cut through the darkness. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft thud and what sounded like rapid movement. "Police department," Officer Lee called out, his voice firm but calm. "Is anyone here?" Their flashlights revealed a tidy bedroom with a neatly made queen-sized bed topped with a handmade quilt. Family photos lined the walls, children growing up through the years, holiday gatherings, and precious moments frozen in time. But it was the sound of labored breathing coming from the far side of the bed that drew their immediate attention. Officer Patel quickly found the light switch, flooding the room with warm light from a bedside lamp. What they saw made them both rush forward. Mrs. Wilson lay on the floor, partially hidden by the bed, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. And there, frantically pawing at her face and mewing with desperate determination, was an orange tabby cat. "We need medical assistance at Pine Grove Apartments, Building C, Unit 4B. Officer Lee spoke urgently into his radio. Elderly female found unconscious, breathing but unresponsive. The cat, wearing a name tag that read Charlie, refused to leave Mrs. Wilson's side, continuing to pat her face and letting out distressed meows. Officer Patel knelt beside the unconscious woman, checking her vital signs while trying not to disturb the devoted pet. "Her pulse is weak but steady," Officer Patel reported, noticing an emergency medical alert bracelet on Mrs. Wilson's wrist. "She's diabetic." A quick scan of the room revealed an open drawer with medical supplies, including insulin and a blood sugar testing kit. Mr. Singh, who had been waiting in the hallway, peered in with concern. "Oh no, poor Mrs. Wilson. Charlie never leaves her side. That cat is her whole world since Mr. Wilson passed." The sound of sirens grew louder outside, and within minutes, paramedics rushed into the bedroom with their equipment. Charlie finally moved aside, but only slightly, watching intently as the medical team worked. His orange fur was ruffled, and he looked exhausted. Clearly, he had been trying to help his owner for days. One of the paramedics quickly checked Mrs. Wilson's blood sugar. "It's dangerously low," she announced, immediately preparing a glucose injection. "She's in a hypoglycemic state. Must have been like this for at least a day or two." Officer Patel found herself next to Charlie, who had retreated to a corner but kept his eyes fixed on his owner. She noticed his food bowl in the kitchen was still half full. He had been so focused on helping Mrs. Wilson that he'd barely eaten himself. "You're quite the hero, aren't you?" she said softly, reaching out to stroke his head. Charlie leaned into her touch, but wouldn't take his eyes off the paramedics working on Mrs. Wilson. His persistence in getting help had likely saved her life. The next few minutes were intense as the medical team stabilized Mrs. Wilson. Gradually, her color improved, and her breathing became stronger. As they prepared to transfer her to a stretcher, she began to stir. "Charlie?" Her voice was weak but clear. Immediately, the orange tabby darted forward, pushing past the paramedics to reach her. He began purring loudly, rubbing his face against her hand. "Ma'am, try not to move," the Lee paramedic advised gently. "You've had a severe diabetic episode. Your cat here has been looking out for you. He's the reason we found you in time." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears as she weakly stroked Charlie's fur. "My good boy," she whispered. "You've always taken care of me, haven't you?" As the paramedics prepared to transport Mrs. Wilson to the hospital, Officer Patel arranged for a neighbor to look after Charlie. Mrs. Thompson from 4A immediately volunteered, already heading to her apartment to get a spare cat carrier. "Don't worry, Mrs. Wilson," Officer Patel assured her. "Charlie will be well taken care of until you're back home. He's earned some special treatment after what he's done." The elderly woman managed a small smile. "He's been my guardian angel since my Harold passed. I always told everyone he was special, but now..." Her voice trailed off as emotion overtook her. Officer Lee helped the paramedics maneuver the stretcher through the apartment and down the hallway. The other residents had gathered, concerned for their neighbor. As Mrs. Wilson was wheeled past, several of them called out words of encouragement and promises to check on Charlie. Back in the apartment, Mrs. Thompson had arrived with the carrier, but Charlie was reluctant to leave the spot where his owner had been lying. Officer Patel knelt down beside him again. "She's going to be okay, buddy," she said softly. "You did your job, and you did it perfectly. Now it's time to let the doctors take care of her." Whether it was the tone of her voice or some deeper understanding, Charlie finally allowed himself to be coaxed into the carrier. As Mrs. Thompson carried him to her apartment, his eyes remained fixed on the hallway where the paramedics had taken his beloved owner. Officer Patel stood in the now quiet apartment, taking a moment to process what had happened. In her years on the force, she'd seen many things, but this display of devotion from a pet to their owner touched her deeply. She made a mental note to follow up on Mrs. Wilson's condition and maybe bring Charlie some special treats during his temporary stay with Mrs. Thompson. As she and Officer Lee headed back to their patrol cars, the night felt different somehow. The earlier exhaustion had been replaced by a profound sense of having witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that love and loyalty come in many forms, and sometimes the biggest heroes have 4 paws and a tail. The emergency room buzzed with its usual late-night activity as the paramedics wheeled Mrs. Wilson through the automatic doors. Officer Patel had followed the ambulance to the hospital, feeling personally invested in this case. Something about the elderly woman and her devoted cat had touched her heart in a way that went beyond routine police work. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as medical staff swarmed around Mrs. Wilson, checking vital signs and preparing for treatment. Despite her condition, the elderly woman kept asking about Charlie, her voice weak but filled with concern for her faithful companion. "Your cat is safe with Mrs. Thompson," Officer Patel reassured her, walking alongside the gurney until they reached the treatment area. "Try to focus on getting better. Charlie will be waiting for you when you get home." Dr. Singh, the emergency physician on duty, quickly assessed Mrs. Wilson's condition. "Severe hypoglycemia," he confirmed, studying the paramedics' report. "We'll need to stabilize her blood sugar and run some tests to make sure there's no organ damage from the prolonged episode." As the medical team worked, Officer Patel stepped into the hallway and pulled out her notebook. She needed to document everything for her report, but her mind kept drifting to the scene they discovered in the apartment. The image of Charlie, exhausted but determined, refusing to leave his owner's side, would stay with her for a long time. Her phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Thompson updating her on Charlie. The orange tabby had finally eaten some food but remained restless, constantly checking the door as if expecting Mrs. Wilson to walk in at any moment. The message included a photo of Charlie sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the parking lot below. Back in the treatment room, Mrs. Wilson had begun to tell her story in between the medical staff's questions and checks. She remembered feeling dizzy while reading in her living room several days ago. She had tried to reach her emergency alert button, but had fallen before she could press it. After that, everything was a blur of semi-consciousness. "I remember Charlie's face," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "He kept pawing at me, trying to wake me up. Even in my confused state, I could feel him there, hear him meowing. He never gave up on me." The nurses working around her smiled at her words. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, patted Mrs. Wilson's hand. "Animals know," she said softly. "They just know when something's wrong, and they never abandon their people." Officer Patel listened as Mrs. Wilson continued, describing how Charlie would disappear briefly and return, as if checking the door for help. He had brought his toys to her, dropped them on her face, anything to try to get a response. When that didn't work, he had started making as much noise as he could, scratching at the walls and crying until someone finally heard him. "He's always been special," Mrs. Wilson said proudly, her voice growing stronger as the glucose and fluids helped her recover. "When my Harold passed away 2 years ago, Charlie didn't leave my side for weeks. He would sleep on Harold's pillow, as if keeping watch over me." The story spread quickly through the emergency department. Staff members found excuses to pass by Mrs. Wilson's room, touched by the tale of the devoted cat who had saved his owner's life. One of the younger nurses even pulled up articles on her phone about other cases where pets had alerted others to medical emergencies. You know, Dr. Singh said, reviewing Mrs. Wilson's improving vital signs, there's growing research about animals' ability to detect medical crisis. Some can sense dropping blood sugar levels or approaching seizures. Charlie might have known something was wrong even before you fell. As the night shifted into early morning, Officer Patel prepared to leave. She had stayed well past her shift, wanting to make sure Mrs. Wilson was stable. The elderly woman would need to remain in the hospital for observation, but her prognosis was good, thanks to her remarkable orange guardian angel. "Would you do me a favor?" Mrs. Wilson asked as Officer Patel said goodbye. "Could you check on Charlie again? He gets anxious when I'm not there, and Mrs. Thompson might need some help with him." Officer Patel smiled warmly. "Of course. I'll stop by on my way home and make sure he's doing okay. Maybe bring him some special treats. He's earned them." Walking through the hospital parking lot, Officer Patel felt a profound sense of gratitude. In her line of work, she often saw the darker side of humanity, but tonight had reminded her of the pure, unconditional love that existed in the world. A small cat had shown more dedication and courage than many humans she'd encountered. She made a mental note to recommend Charlie for the police department's civilian commendation, usually reserved for people who assisted law enforcement, but surely they could make an exception for such an extraordinary cat. After all, without his persistence, this story could have had a very different ending. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges as Officer Patel drove toward Pine Grove Apartments. Her shift had ended hours ago, but she didn't mind the extra time. Some cases touched your heart in unexpected ways, reminding you why you chose this profession in the first place. And sometimes, she thought with a smile, the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages, complete with whiskers and a tail. The morning sun had fully risen by the time Officer Patel pulled into the Pine Grove Apartments parking lot. Despite her exhaustion, she knew she couldn't go home without checking on Charlie. She grabbed the bag of premium cat treats she picked up from the 24-hour convenience store and headed toward Building C. Mrs. Thompson answered her door quickly, still wearing her nightgown and robe. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, ushering Officer Patel inside. "Charlie's been pacing all night. I tried everything to calm him down, but he just sits by the door or window waiting." They found Charlie perched on the windowsill, his orange fur glowing in the morning light. His tail twitched anxiously as he stared out at the parking lot. When he heard Officer Patel's footsteps, he turned and let out a soft meow, as if asking for news about his owner. "Hey there, brave boy," Officer Patel said softly, kneeling beside him. She opened the bag of treats, offering one in her palm. Charlie sniffed it hesitantly, then gently took it, his eyes never leaving her face. It was almost as if he understood she had information about Mrs. Wilson. "Your mom is doing much better," she told him, feeling only slightly silly for talking to a cat. "The doctors are taking good care of her, just like you did." Charlie's ears perked up at her gentle tone, and he moved closer, allowing her to stroke his head. Mrs. Thompson watched from the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "You know, I've lived next door to Rose for 15 years. That cat has been her lifeline since her husband passed. But I never imagined." She shook her head, overcome with emotion. Officer Patel spent the next hour with Charlie, telling Mrs. Thompson about Mrs. Wilson's condition and the hospital staff's reaction to Charlie's heroic actions. The elderly neighbor made coffee, and they sat in her cozy living room while Charlie alternated between watching the window and curling up next to Officer Patel. "The emergency alert system she has," Officer Patel mentioned, remembering the device they'd found in the apartment. "It was just out of her reach when she fell. If Charlie hadn't made so much noise." "That's what makes it even more remarkable," Mrs. Thompson nodded. "He knew exactly what to do. You hear stories about animals doing extraordinary things to save their owners, but to witness it in our own building." She shook her head in wonder. As they talked, other neighbors began stopping by, having heard about the night's events. Each one had a story about Mrs. Wilson and Charlie. How that orange tabby would sit with her in the garden while she tended her flowers, how he would wait by the elevator every Sunday morning for her return from church, how he seemed to know when she was having a difficult day and would barely leave her side. Mr. Kumar from 4C brought over some leftover fish from his dinner, specially cooked for Charlie. "My wife always says he's the most polite cat she's ever met," he said, smiling as Charlie delicately ate the offered food. "Every morning when Mrs. Wilson takes her walk in the garden, he nods to us through the window, just like a proper gentleman." Around mid-morning, Officer Patel's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Mrs. Wilson was doing well, her blood sugar levels had stabilized, and she was resting comfortably. The doctors wanted to keep her for another day of observation, but her recovery was progressing better than expected. The news spread quickly through the small gathering of neighbors, bringing smiles and sighs of relief. Charlie, as if sensing the positive atmosphere, finally settled down for a proper nap in a patch of sunlight. Officer Patel took advantage of the quiet moment to make some calls back to the station. Her supervisor was intrigued by her suggestion about the civilian commendation for Charlie. "Never done anything like that before," he mused over the phone. "But then again, we've never had a case quite like this. Let me see what I can do." She also learned that the local news had gotten wind of the story. A reporter was eager to interview her about the rescue, particularly interested in Charlie's role. Officer Patel looked at the sleeping cat, knowing his story could help raise awareness about the importance of checking on elderly neighbors and the incredible bonds between pets and their owners. As the morning wore on, more neighbors organized a schedule to visit Mrs. Wilson in the hospital and take turns checking on Charlie. They discussed making spare keys available to multiple neighbors and setting up a phone tree for future emergencies. What had started as a frightening incident was bringing the whole community closer together. "You know what this reminds me of?" Mrs. Thompson said, refilling coffee cups. "That quote about how heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear fur and whiskers, and they remind us that love doesn't need words to save a life." Officer Patel finally prepared to leave around noon, her body reminding her that she'd been awake for far too long. Charlie had woken from his nap and was back at his window post, but he seemed calmer now. When she said goodbye, he came over and rubbed against her legs, purring loudly. "I'll come back to check on you," she promised, giving him one last scratch behind the ears. "And soon you'll be back home with your mom, where you belong." As she drove home, Officer Patel reflected on how a routine welfare check had turned into something so meaningful. In her years on the force, she'd seen countless examples of human courage and kindness, but there was something special about this case, about a small orange cat who refused to give up on his owner, and in doing so, reminded an entire community about the power of love and vigilance. The next few days at Pine Grove Apartments brought a flurry of activity unlike anything the quiet building had seen before. Word of Charlie's heroic actions had spread beyond the local community, catching the attention of regional news outlets. The story of an ordinary cat's extraordinary dedication touched hearts everywhere it was shared. Officer Patel, despite being off duty, found herself returning to the building regularly. She'd grown attached to both Charlie and the tight-knit community that had rallied around Mrs. Wilson. Each visit revealed new aspects of the bonds between neighbors that had strengthened in the wake of the incident. The building's community room had become an impromptu headquarters for organizing care packages, scheduling hospital visits, and planning Mrs. Wilson's homecoming. Mrs. Thompson, still hosting Charlie, had become the central point of contact, her apartment buzzing with visitors bringing updates and offering help. "You wouldn't believe the calls we're getting," Mrs. Thompson told Officer Patel over tea. "People from all over town want to help. The local pet store is donating a year's worth of premium cat food for Charlie. Someone even offered to pay Mrs. Wilson's medical bills, though she's too proud to accept." Charlie had settled into a routine, though his dedication never wavered. Every morning, he would sit by the window, watching the parking lot. Every afternoon, he would wait by the door when the elevator dinged, hoping to see his owner. The neighbors made sure to stop by and spend time with him, bringing treats and toys, but his eyes always held a patient longing. The hospital updates were consistently positive. Mrs. Wilson's recovery had progressed remarkably well, her spirits lifted by the steady stream of visitors and the photos of Charlie that neighbors shared on their phones. The doctors were impressed by her resilience, noting that her quick recovery was likely due to Charlie's timely intervention. "The nurses tell me she keeps the photo of Charlie on her bedside table," Officer Patel shared with the gathered neighbors. "She shows it to everyone who comes into her room, telling them how her orange angel saved her life." The local police department had embraced the story wholeheartedly. The chief himself visited Pine Grove to meet Charlie and announced that they would indeed be presenting him with a special commendation, the first time in the department's history that an animal would receive such an honor. "We're calling it the Guardian Angel Award," he explained, watching as Charlie investigated his polished shoes with typical feline curiosity. "We hope it will inspire people to look out for their neighbors just like this little fellow did." The ceremony was planned for the day after Mrs. Wilson's release from the hospital. The community room would be transformed for the occasion, with the police department's public relations team helping to coordinate the media coverage. Local children had even made a special cat-sized medal, complete with an orange ribbon to match Charlie's fur. As preparations continued, Officer Patel noticed something remarkable happening in the building. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now planning potluck dinners. A retired nurse from the second floor volunteered to check in on elderly residents regularly. Someone suggested starting a building newsletter to help everyone stay connected. "It's like Charlie didn't just save Mrs. Wilson," Mr. Kumar observed, watching a group of residents setting up a phone tree system. "He woke us all up to what community really means." The day before Mrs. Wilson's scheduled return, Officer Patel helped the neighbors prepare her apartment. They cleaned and aired out the rooms, stocked the refrigerator with easy-to-prepare meals, and set up a new emergency alert system, this one with multiple buttons placed strategically throughout the apartment. Mrs. Thompson brought Charlie over to inspect their work. The orange tabby walked through each room slowly, as if making sure everything was in order for his owner's return. He paid special attention to Mrs. Wilson's favorite chair, sniffing it carefully before curling up in it, the first time he properly relaxed since the incident. "He knows she's coming home," Mrs. Thompson said softly, watching Charlie's peaceful expression. Animals have a way of sensing these things. That evening, as Officer Patel prepared to leave, she found herself standing in Mrs. Wilson's bedroom, looking at the spot where they'd found her that fateful night. The scene could have been tragic, but instead, it had become a story of hope, love, and community, all because of one determined cat who refused to give up. Charlie appeared at her side, rubbing against her legs with a loud purr. Officer Patel knelt down to scratch behind his ears, remembering how desperate his cries had been just days ago. Now his eyes were bright with anticipation, knowing his vigil was almost over. "You've taught us all something important," she told him quietly. "Sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones who simply love without limits, who keep watching, keep trying, keep caring, no matter what." As she left the building, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges that matched Charlie's fur. Tomorrow would bring Mrs. Wilson home, would bring ceremonies and celebrations, would bring tears of joy and relief. But tonight, in a quiet apartment, a small orange cat curled up in his owner's chair, keeping watch, just as he always had. A silent guardian with a heart bigger than anyone could have imagined. The morning of Mrs. Wilson's return dawned bright and clear. Pine Grove Apartments was abuzz with activity from early morning, as neighbors made final preparations for her homecoming. The lobby had been decorated with welcome home signs, and someone had even tied orange ribbons around the potted plants, a tribute to Charlie's heroic deed. Officer Patel arrived early, having volunteered to drive Mrs. Wilson home from the hospital. She found Charlie sitting alertly by Mrs. Thompson's front door, as if he somehow knew this was the day he'd been waiting for. When Mrs. Thompson opened the door, the orange tabby darted out and headed straight for the elevator. "He hasn't done that once since she's been gone," Mrs. Thompson said, amazed. "He really knows she's coming home today." The drive to the hospital was filled with nervous excitement. Officer Patel couldn't help smiling as she thought about the reunion ahead. In her rearview mirror, she could see news vans already pulling into the apartment complex parking lot. The story of Charlie's devotion had captured hearts across the state. At the hospital, Mrs. Wilson was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, already dressed and ready to go. Her face lit up when she saw Officer Patel. "Is my boy okay?" were her first words, even before saying hello. "Has he been eating? Does he know I'm coming home?" "He's been waiting for you every single day," Officer Patel assured her, helping gather the cards and flowers that had accumulated in the hospital room. This morning, he was already at the elevator, like he knew today was special. The nurse doing Mrs. Wilson's final checkup shared how the story had spread through the hospital. "We've been using it to cheer up other patients," she said, checking Mrs. Wilson's blood pressure one last time. "Telling them about the cat who saved his owner's life. It gives people hope, you know." The ride home was filled with Mrs. Wilson's stories about Charlie, how she'd found him as a kitten in her garden 6 years ago, how he'd bonded with her late husband, how he seemed to always know when she wasn't feeling well. "He's more than just a pet," she said softly. "He's family." As they pulled into Pine Grove's parking lot, they could see a small crowd gathered near the entrance. Neighbors, local news crews, and even the police chief had come to welcome Mrs. Wilson home. But it was the flash of orange fur by the glass doors that caught Mrs. Wilson's eye. "Charlie," she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. The automatic doors hadn't fully opened before Charlie squeezed through, racing toward the car. Officer Patel quickly opened the passenger door, and Charlie leaped straight into Mrs. Wilson's lap, purring so loudly it was almost like a small engine. The reunion brought tears to everyone's eyes. Charlie pressed his face against Mrs. Wilson's cheek, his paws kneading her shoulders as if checking that she was really there. Mrs. Wilson held him close, crying and laughing at the same time. "My brave boy," she kept whispering. "My precious, brave boy." The gathered crowd respectfully held back, allowing them a moment of private reunion. Even the news cameras stayed at a distance, capturing the touching scene without intruding. The police chief dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, trying to maintain his professional composure. When Mrs. Wilson was ready, Officer Patel helped her into the wheelchair they'd brought down. Charlie refused to leave her lap, maintaining physical contact as if afraid she might disappear again. The assembled neighbors applauded as Mrs. Wilson was wheeled toward the building, and someone started singing, "For She's a Jolly Good Fellow." Inside the lobby, Mrs. Wilson was overwhelmed by the decorations and the obvious care her neighbors had taken. "You've all been so wonderful," she said, looking around at the familiar faces. "I don't know how to thank you." "We should be thanking Charlie," Mr. Kumar said, stepping forward with a small wrapped package. "He showed us what it means to be a true neighbor. We've all lived here for years, but it took a cat to teach us how to really look out for each other." The package contained a new collar for Charlie, deep blue leather with a special tag that read "Hero of Pine Grove." Charlie allowed Mrs. Thompson to put it on him, though he never moved from Mrs. Wilson's lap. As they made their way up to the 4th floor, neighbors shared updates about the changes they'd made. They told her about the new phone tree system, the regular check-ins they'd organized, the community bulletin board they'd started. Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears again as she realized how her community had come together. Finally, they reached her apartment. Officer Patel unlocked the door, and Charlie immediately perked up, ready to show his owner back into their home. The apartment had been cleaned and brightened with fresh flowers. On the coffee table, next to Mrs. Wilson's favorite chair, sat her unfinished book from that fateful night, now with a new bookmark, a photo of Charlie in his new collar. "Welcome home, both of you," Officer Patel said, watching as Charlie led Mrs. Wilson to her chair, circling her feet as she sat down. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. In that moment, it was hard to believe that just a week ago, this same room had been the site of such drama. Mrs. Wilson reached down to stroke Charlie's fur, and he pressed his head into her hand, his paw rumbling contentedly. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "people say animals can't understand love the way we do. But I think sometimes they understand it better. They love purely, completely, without hesitation or condition. Charlie didn't just save my life. He showed us all what love really means." As Officer Patel prepared to leave them to settle in, she took one last look at the pair in their sunny corner. Charlie had climbed onto the arm of the chair, his paw resting protectively on Mrs. Wilson's shoulder, both of them exactly where they belonged, together, safe, and surrounded by a community that would never forget the lesson an orange cat had taught them about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of heroism. 1 month after Mrs. Wilson's return home, Pine Grove Apartments had transformed into a different place entirely. The once quiet building now buzzed with community activities, weekly gatherings, and a genuine sense of family among its residents. The story of Charlie's heroism had sparked a change that went far beyond one cat and his owner. The police department's special ceremony for Charlie had turned into something much bigger than anyone expected. Local media coverage had caught the attention of national news outlets, and soon the story of the orange hero cat had spread across the country. Letters and packages arrived daily from people touched by the tale of devotion and community spirit. Officer Patel, who had stayed in touch with Mrs. Wilson and Charlie, arrived early on the morning of the ceremony. She found the community room transformed with decorations, including paw print streamers and a special cushioned chair for the guest of honor. Charlie, wearing his blue hero of Pine Grove color, sat regally beside Mrs. Wilson, accepting gentle pets from excited children who had come to see the famous cat. "He's handling all this attention pretty well," Mrs. Wilson said proudly, watching Charlie graciously receive another admiring visitor. "Though he still won't let me out of his sight for more than a few minutes. Every time I leave the apartment, he's waiting by the door when I return." The ceremony itself was simple but touching. The police chief presented Charlie with a custom-made medallion, which Mrs. Thompson had cleverly attached to a comfortable harness so it wouldn't weigh down his collar. Charlie sat perfectly still during the presentation, as if understanding the importance of the moment. "In my 30 years of service," the chief said, addressing the packed room, "I've seen many acts of heroism. But sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who remind us of our shared humanity, even if they happen to be a cat." This brought chuckles from the crowd, especially when Charlie chose that moment to start grooming himself. But the real impact of Charlie's story went beyond medals and ceremonies. The residents of Pine Grove had started a Guardian Angels program, inspired by their feline hero. Every elderly or vulnerable resident now had a network of neighbors checking on them regularly. The building's community board was filled with sign-up sheets for shopping helpers, medical appointment buddies, and evening walking groups. Mrs. Wilson had become the heart of this new community spirit. Her apartment, once a quiet haven for just her and Charlie, now regularly hosted afternoon tea gatherings where neighbors shared stories and planned community activities. Charlie presided over these meetings from his favorite windowsill, occasionally making rounds to collect pets from visitors. "You know what the most amazing thing is?" Mrs. Thompson remarked during one such gathering. "Before all this happened, most of us barely knew each other beyond a quick hello in the hallway. Now look at us, we're like family." The children in the building have started a weekend pet care club offering to help elderly residents with their animals. They'd even created a hand-drawn map showing which apartments had pets, with Charlie's picture prominently featured at the top as their inspiration. Officer Patel found herself stopping by regularly, even when she wasn't on duty. She'd grown attached to the community and its orange-furred guardian angel. Each visit showed her new ways that one cat's devotion had rippled out to touch more lives. Local schools had started inviting Mrs. Wilson and Charlie to speak about pet care and community awareness. Charlie, ever the gentleman, would sit quietly in his special carrier while Mrs. Wilson shared their story. Children wrote letters and drew pictures of the hero cat, many of which now decorated Mrs. Wilson's walls. The story had also inspired other communities to start their own neighbor check programs. Senior living facilities across the state began encouraging pet ownership, recognizing the vital role animals could play in their residents' lives. Some shelters even reported increased adoption rates for orange cats, dubbed the Charlie effect by local media. One evening, as Officer Patel sat with Mrs. Wilson and Charlie in their cozy living room, they reflected on how much had changed since that frightening night. Charlie lay stretched across both their laps, purring contentedly as the setting sun painted the room in warm golden light. "You know," Mrs. Wilson said softly, stroking Charlie's fur, "when Harold passed away, I was so afraid of being alone. But Charlie showed me that I was never really alone at all. And now, thanks to him, I have a whole building full of family." Outside, they could hear the cheerful sounds of neighbors chatting in the hallway, children laughing as they played in the community room, and the general bustle of a building full of people who had learned to truly care for one another. Charlie lifted his head and blinked slowly at both women, his green eyes full of that mysterious wisdom that only cats seem to possess. Then he settled back down, secure in the knowledge that his human was safe, his community was strong, and his work, for now at least, was done. As Officer Patel prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway, watching Charlie escort her to the door as he now did with all visitors. "Sometimes," she said, "it takes something extraordinary to remind us of the ordinary magic that's around us every day, the magic of caring, of paying attention, of simply being there for each other. Mrs. Wilson nodded, reaching down to scratch Charlie's ears. And sometimes, she added with a smile, that reminder comes with whiskers and a tail. Charlie's story had started with a desperate cry in the night, but it had grown into something much more, a testament to the power of love in its purest form, a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and proof that one small act of devotion could transform an entire community. In the end, it wasn't just about a cat who saved his owner's life. It was about how that cat taught an entire building full of people how to be better humans.